Welcome to Reinventors and the Reinvent America series. I'm Peter Leiden, and I'm the host of the series. Reinventors, these roundtables, routinely gathers innovators from around the country and the world over this new medium of interactive group video to work on helping solve kind of the big challenges facing the country, and also to really deal each session with a question that we put to a group of innovators of diverse backgrounds. Now, these roundtables work best when someone comes to the roundtable with a big idea that actually can really start the conversation and that the group can really build on and make better and test it out. And in fact, we are going to hit the high bar today with exactly what we're doing here today. Because what we're going to do today is we're going to reinvent risk and reward, and we're going to explore this question. Could the federal government invest more in long-term R&D for technology if it not only took all the risk in those long-term investments, but also shared in the rewards? And we've got an anchor who's been thinking a lot about this question, has developed a really interesting idea around this, and it is one that I think the group that we've gathered here could actually help improve to some extent. Now, Mariana Mazzucato holds the prestigious chair in innovation economics at Sussex University in England. From there, she's advised the UK government, European community on innovation-led growth, we could say. She's also the author of a terrific new book called The Entrepreneurial State, debunking the private public sector myths that are out there right now. And now, she was recently in San Francisco. She gave a terrific lecture here, and I had the opportunity, the privilege to actually spend some time with her talking about her ideas, and she said she would really appreciate engaging the tech community in particular on this idea of how the private and public sector could rethink the distribution of the risk and rewards around these long-term investments in R&D for the next generations of technologies. And she's going to lay that out in a short time here. Now, this is a perfect question for this Reinvent America series, and partly because our partners in this series that really helping us pull this off are Tech for America, or T4A.org. They're actually a group of entrepreneurs and technologists who are really concerned in their mission to actually redefine this private-public sector relationship. And so they've helped us pull together a great group here, as well as Mariana herself. So before we actually get to Mariana and let her lay out her idea, let's go around the table and actually have everyone introduce themselves and just say what they bring to the table, as we say, that's relevant to the question at hand. So Aneesh, why don't we start with you? You were recently, I think, on the Daily Show, so you know how to jump in here in the media environment and give a little introduction to yourself. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I had the honor and privilege of serving as Chief Technology Officer for President Obama, and one of the initiatives we focused on was what we called Startup America, which was really a call to action to help bring new ideas, in many cases from lab to the market. And so from that work, we initiated a series of activities that hopefully we'll talk about today that build on a lot of the concepts that I hope will frame the discussion. So had a lot of fun. I too have just finished that book, Innovative State, where I try to take a lot of these same principles and talk about them for all levels of government, federal, state, and local.
Terrific. Robert, why don't you jump in and give us a little bit about your background that you bring to the table here? Oops, unmute. You got to unmute first.
Okay. Am I unmuted now? Seems to be. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Peter, for having me. Mariana, thank you for the invitation. And I come to the roundtable with three perspectives. One is a semi-retired technology executive and investor. Been in the tech world for about 30 years, founded 4 companies, and been an investor in many more, and have worked in the entrepreneurial area in both the U.S., the U.K., and Switzerland. The second hat is I'm passionate about discussing issues of the day at the World Economic Forum, in Davos, in Socrates, in Aspen, and most recently here in the Bay Area at longnow.org, which is where I met Mariana. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly for the context of this discussion, I'm a taxpayer. So looking forward to the discussion.
That's terrific. Ed, do you want to jump in and give a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I think probably unlike anyone else on this panel, I'm not an expert. I'm neither a funder of or a beneficiary of R&D in the commercial world, nor am I a scholar like Mariana. But I am, as the Financial Times chief US commentator and columnist, have a deep and abiding interest in American competitiveness. I've written a book called Time to Start Thinking, America and the Spectre of Decline, in which there is a chapter on the threat to long-term US innovation capacity through declining public involvement in R&D and through declining public funding, in particular for fundamental research, and the sort of serendipity that comes with that. And so I sort of come to it from that, I guess, fairly generalist angle as a journalist observing America's competitiveness challenges and seeing R&D as absolutely critical to its past and future success. And I should add, Mariana's book, The Entrepreneurial State, is sort of a really good Bible for people who want to think about this and learn about this.
Completely agree. Thanks for that. David, you want to jump in and give you a little bit of your background?
Sure. You know, I'm a mathematician, but I was an engineer at one of our, well-known, federally created startup companies called Google, which wouldn't have existed without, both government investment in the internet and then government funding of research and fellowships at Stanford, of which the whole thing was launched. So that, I don't think that gives me any particular expertise on this subject, but it certainly gives me an emotional and, psychological connection to the importance of it. And now I'm an investor, consultant, philanthropist.
Great. It's great to have you on here. Banning, you want to give a little bit of your background?
Sure. Thank you for having me on, Peter and Mariana. And I was also very impressed with Mariana's book. And I work at a think tank in Washington, and we had Mariana speaker twice. So now I'm very pleased to be part of this. I come at it from a slightly the other end of things, I might say. I've been doing sort of global strategy stuff for about 40 years in U.S., China. And then I got involved with the National Intelligence Council's long-term global trends reports, helping produce those, which led me to much more concern and focus on the big global challenges: climate change, energy, food, water, demographics, all the big issues facing the world. That led to much more interest in technology, which led to more interest in trying to bridge the gap between Washington and Silicon Valley, both literally and figuratively. I've worked a lot with Aneesh's colleagues over at State and AID and even the Defense Department, trying to bring them together, because we find in Washington that the foreign policy community generally doesn't know anything about the two biggest things shaping the world forward, which I believe are technology and urbanization. And they kind of rule it out because they don't know about it. And yet these are the things we really need to focus on as we move forward. So from that perspective, I look at these big challenges and say, we better figure out how to move forward in these technologies. I also believe it needs to be an international cooperative effort on so many of the big challenges. And therefore, Mariana's work, both in showing the role of the state in really being a risk taker to produce the Googles and all with the internet and GPS, all that, that we need to figure out how to move that forward. And I think her proposal is, obviously something we really need to discuss. But that's the way I come at this issue, sort of back opposite direction than the entrepreneurs and inventors have come to build the technologies. I'm saying, how can we move it forward and address big challenges with those technologies?
Absolutely, thanks. And it's a terrific group gathered here. And before we turn it to Mariana, I will say one thing. We have a saying around Reinventors here, which is known as smart as everyone. And so we really do value the folks who are watching this live or potentially later, asynchronously. Do on our website, reinventors.net, you can basically comment there, put your ideas, comments, feedback, questions. We're also in the Google Plus environment. There's a conversation there. You can actually engage there. And if you're on Twitter, or use the hashtag Reinventors. We have people watching this, cycling in some of the best stuff. And when we do a package of videos and write-ups at the next couple days at the end of this, we'll definitely get some of the best insights from you as well. So anyhow, let's go back now to start with Mariana. And Mariana has laid out on our site about a 10-minute video version of her idea. But for those who weren't able to see that, why don't you tee up kind of the basic idea that we're going to be discussing, and before we roll into the conversation.
Sorry, should I speak, or are you putting on the video?
No, you're on. No, you're on. Go ahead. Lean in.
Right. Okay, so I think I want to start off with why we should even ask the question more than what the answer is, because I think that's sort of the key place to begin, because my first point is that the way we talk about the state in, let's just call it the innovation ecosystem, within the economics of innovation and amongst economists, but also obviously amongst politicians, because as Keynes said, politicians are the slaves of defunct economists, is that at best what the government is doing is either fixing different types of market failures. So, basic research, for example, is a public good. Too little investment by the private sector in that, and hence we need the public sector to invest in basic research. Very few people disagree with that. What has not been understood is the degree to which, in fact, in the few places in the world, are you guys still there? Is it working? Good. In the few places in the world that have actually achieved smart innovation-led growth, so Silicon Valley in the past, but I would argue different places today, including China, Germany, Denmark, Finland, Brazil, what you've had is very active state along the entire innovation chain. So basic research, applied research, early stage funding of companies. And the risk is obviously high along that entire chain. And because innovation is so uncertain, what it means is, lots of failure. We know this most recently with some examples where, the government not only has invested a lot in the research around, say, clean technology, but has also been making some direct loans to particular companies, so Solyndra and Tesla. And Solyndra, big failure. Tesla, big success. For every Tesla, the statistics basically show us there's about 20 Solyndras. This is just as true for private venture capital. What, however, we have with private venture capital, which we don't have with the state investments, is the ability of some of the returns from the successes to both cover the losses, which are inevitable, as well as the next round. Now, a traditional response to this would be, well, of course the state gets back the return through the taxation system, both because the companies that are being that are having these direct investments, whether it's Google's algorithm funded by the National Science Foundation, whether it's Apple, all the technologies behind the iPhone funded by the taxpayer, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, or whether it's the companies themselves receiving this early stage seed finance, which both Compaq and Intel did through SBIR, and again, Tesla and Solyndra through these guaranteed loans from the government. What the traditional response is that these companies pay tax, right, as well as the people who are hired by these companies and all the spillovers, that tax revenue comes back to government. And basically, I think that's no longer true. And it's not myself who's saying it. Just open up any important paper around the world. They're all talking about this dilemma where Google, Apple, Amazon actually don't pay much tax. Now, one could say, fine, so fix that system. And let's pretend actually that we don't have any of these loopholes, which we know now exist. Apple's moving one of its main subsidiaries to Reno, Nevada, in order not to pay the tax in Cupertino, California. Let's pretend they don't do that, and they're actually paying the tax they should be paying. Well, there's also a problem there, which is that taxes are no longer what they used to be. And what's very interesting to me is that how taxes have changed has actually co-evolved with a discourse about who the innovators are. So it was actually the National Venture Capital Association that in 1976 lobbied government very hard to get the capital gains tax reduced from 40% to 20% in just 5 years, from 76 to 81. The upper marginal rate under the communist U.S. President Eisenhower was about 90%, close to 90% in real terms, the upper top rate. So rather than saying we should go back to that taxation system, because I think it's quite unrealistic, my point is let's just try to socialize, also some of the rewards through different types of mechanisms, which I'm hoping this conversation can lead to. This could occur through income contingent loans. We do it with students. Why not with businesses? It could occur through retaining some sort of equity. In Scandinavia, they do this. It's quite common. So Citra, which invested in early stage Nokia, retained equity. It could also happen through retention of a golden share of the IPR, the patents. And let me just give two quick examples before we open up the conversation, just to show that actually I'm not the first thinking about this. Policymakers have thought about it, but then they haven't had the courage to exercise it. With the Tesla loan, 465 million guaranteed loan, Solyndras was just over 500. In the Tesla loan agreement, it actually said that government should be able to buy 3 million shares when the Tesla price was still low. It was $9 a share when that loan was taken out. By the time the loan was paid back in 2013, the price per share was 96. Government did not exercise any right to buy back or to buy the shares. And the question is, why? And I think it's because the narrative we have out there about innovation makes government scared to seem too engaged. You know, they shouldn't be making profits. And I think that's really unrealistic. Because, again, being able to earn something from that investment would have helped to cover some of the Solyndra loss, which, of course, would also help the taxpayers to support these kind of investments. Second example, the Bayh-Dole Act, which in 1980 allowed publicly funded research to be patented. Before that, the idea was if it's publicly funded, the research should remain, if you want, in the open domain. In that act, which basically spurred off the whole biotech revolution with these, you know, with research that was already happening, but all of a sudden it could be privatized through patents, which created all these spin-outs in biotech. In that act, they thought about this. They said, we should be careful not to make the taxpayer pay twice for the research and then for these very high drug prices, which are charged all over the world. In some countries, they simply have a welfare state which purchases it, but it's still very high prices, as we know. Well, and so in the act, it says government should have the right, the marching right, to have a say on the prices of the drugs that are publicly funded. Never exercised that right. So I think it's not just a question of what these particular schemes might be. It's also why is it that government is so scared to take a share? How can we change the debate, change the discussion, change the language we use? So instead of just talking about government de-risking the private sector, we admit that it's actually taking on massive risk. In doing so, it will often fail. And where will the money come from? Should we just put tax back to what it was? Should we just print the money, you know, do directed quantitative easing? Or should we do something much more realistic, which is think about these other types of schemes?
Mariana, that's a fantastic. That was a fantastic layout of the idea there. I think maybe to start out here, were you done? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
I am done. I just felt like I was talking to myself.
No, it's terrific. Appreciate that. Well, I tell you what, I think why don't we let's get a reaction from everyone in the roundtable a little bit about. She laid out a lot of big ideas there, but let's get a sense of just some thoughts, just in general, about what she's laying out there. I don't know, Aneesh, do you want to start, or let's just everyone just kind of give a little sense of where they're coming from in reaction to the idea she's putting out there, the concept. Oh, you're muted, Aneesh.
All right, there we go. Let me begin by just saying I absolutely applaud sort of the vision and the direction that we should do more to facilitate investments in this area. My initial reaction has been that we have a lot of existing tools on the table that we can tweak and make better, such that we have more capital flowing towards higher risk research and development projects that will have far greater return, even if we don't yet reconcile how and when to negotiate a particular equity stake. Now, if you think about all the scale of the $130+ billion of R&D spend out of the federal government, when you take a look at the share that goes to higher education institutions or universities, there we've essentially decentralized this judgment. University tech transfer offices have the full right to negotiate equity stakes, licensing agreements, and any other forms of compensation, and in a sort of spirit of democracy and innovation, let each of those university officers kind of pick and choose the tools that work right for them. And you have plenty of case studies where universities have commercialized research and have seen upside on account of that, those judgments. So we have a good base on which to see the benefits. But the reality is the aggregate amount of capital put towards R&D is still too low, and given all of the pressures on the budget we have in Washington, my initial inclination is to say, let's move the aggregate figure up without worrying yet about the monetization aspect, given just the sheer scale and magnitude of the investments that we make. Going from 130 billion to 132, where 2 extra can be invested for equity purposes, might be an interesting debate. But moving 130 to 140 or 150 feels like a place where we've got to get everybody on the same page. We've had a sort of a moral commitment to this with the Competes Act from earlier in the decade. We're not yet on pace to the doubling that we committed to, so let's kind of keep the pressure up. I'm proud that President Obama, even in tough fiscal environments, is keeping that aggregate number up relative to other cuts that have had to be made. So big picture, I love the idea that we should pump more into the innovation ecosystem. Generally speaking, thankful that we have enough tools out in the universities and even in the federal labs to monetize some of it, even if it's not full equity stakes, perhaps as envisioned.
Well, I'd first of all share, Aneesh, your appreciation for Mariana's challenge, and have learned a little bit from you with respect to what the real numbers are and how it looks in Washington. I'm not familiar enough with how the federal government programs work today. In preparing for today's discussion, I had a bit of a think and reflected on Mariana's hook idea about Tesla, and the idea that the government failed to exercise warrants, I think they were, and recoup the investment and make a profit on that. And again, not being familiar with the details of the structure of the deal, but understanding that it may be likely that government doesn't really have a method or a methodology for exercising warrants and taking in that income. It would be interesting to understand better from those more expert than I in how the government could harvest that kind of return on investment. But I also began to think about one of the other big challenges we have before us, and I think Edward, it was you who talked about, Banning, it was you who talked about some of the big problems, climate change, food, water, etc. There's another fantastically apropos challenge, which is around redistribution of wealth and sort of the 1% Occupy movement. I don't know if this is realistic, but I think it might be an interesting thing to grant warrants or options, actually, in government investments in companies to ordinary citizens on the premise that the tax dollars funding the particular investments came, after all, from taxes harvested from ordinary citizens. And if there were a way to give ordinary citizens options in companies, then they may be more interested in the success of those companies, may engage more in technology overall, and may actually have an interest in decisions by the government. For example, Solyndra, the decision to cut Solyndra, government funding, and allow Solyndra to fail, affected all the option holders in Solyndra. So I think it would be an interesting question. It might be an interesting development to see how society, transformed as option holders, might share in both the upside and also the decision making, or at least the collective emphasis on what happens when a decision has to be made to pull the plug on a private enterprise company that's funded by their tax dollars.
Great. David, you want to just jump in? That was terrific.
Sure. So I'll make 3 quick comments. One is that, I personally paid millions of dollars in taxes as a result of Google's success. So the idea that there's no revenue being generated back to the government from these kinds of investments, I think, is overstated. Secondly, related to that, I want to push back on the idea that somehow we've got a shortage of resources, and looking for other new funding mechanisms is the only way we could possibly support the historical level of investment. The main reason we're not investing in research and support for entrepreneurial mechanism in this country is not that we've got some shortage of tax revenue. It's that it's being directed to much less productive purposes like defense and a healthcare system that costs way too much and for what we get. And those are being allowed to squeeze out funding for the kinds of things we're talking about here, as well as infrastructure and education and other traditional functions of government. And those things, that squeezing out is a political problem that could happen anyway, regardless of our funding mechanism. We could shift to some great new funding mechanism that develops a lot of funding based on profit and return. And if that's working well and it's funding these things, the Congress can still cut back on all the other kinds of funding, the other $130 billion that Aneesh talked about. So unless we solve that political problem, it's not clear how a new funding mechanism is going to work. And the third point is, I'm just unconvinced that the government is ever going to do a very good job of this kind of investing. And that's illustrated by the example of how the government actually did have the mechanism and the rights to make money from warrants on Tesla, and yet it didn't execute on that. And that's a hard thing to change because the incentives of government administrators are fundamentally different than the incentives of venture capitalists, private equity investors, and I'm not sure the government's ever going to do a very good job of those things. That said, there are certainly some worthwhile ideas here. I just think don't want to throw out, the existing system that we're following.
Actually, does anyone, Aneesh, you want to jump in, or if anyone wants to jump in on that, because there's a lot of interesting pieces there.
Yeah, both comments that maybe I could just set some context for this. A lot of attention, obviously, on this Solyndra Tesla kind of issue. Back in 2009, we took a broader view about this innovation question and how do we pump more success. And we really identified three policy areas of interest. One was kind of redoubling our infrastructure investments. Traditionally the country has been thinking about infrastructure as roadways, railways, and runways. And we effectively drew a broader view about this to include digital infrastructure, including smart grid on the energy sector, healthcare IT, broadband for the broader community, and even human capital in many cases. So R&D, human capital, digital infrastructure were seen as now part of that infrastructure bucket where the government takes no equity stake, but rather helps to facilitate the availability of the infrastructure. There's a second layer, which is making sure that we have rules of the road that promote that commercialization activity, make it easier for ideas to go from lab to market, whether it's government-financed R&D or private investments that make their way out into the capital markets. We heard a lot about capital market inefficiencies, and so a big chunk of our work, including the Jobs Act, which was bipartisan, really helped to kind of complexify, if that's the right word, or simplify, maybe the easier way of saying it, a number of the rules from when an idea moves out from the lab into the market and eventually into the capital system, where now we have an on-ramp for IPOs, crowdfunding rules that are yet to be written but on their way, so that the average American can put capital behind some of these startup ideas. And only then, at the very top of that framework, and we had a pyramid was the image if you want to think of it visually, we then said there are a few areas where the government wants to have this all-hands-on-deck approach to unleash this clean energy revolution, to think about healthcare in a more efficient and effective manner. And there were much more very specific tools, not tied to that general R&D bucket, but much more industry specific. We've spent so much time on the energy side with Solyndra Tesla. It's important to note that there are other levers that we pulled. I would say that, for example, the authority to change payment in healthcare, that authority, as part of the Affordable Care Act, has done more to fuel healthcare IT startups. You can just look objectively at all the numbers. The amount of capital flowing into that sector is going through the roof, and a big chunk of the reason is the bet that we're going to reward people who focus on solutions to keep you healthy versus just paying people fix when they're sick. So that authority is actually the big tool akin to what perhaps was the loan guarantee tool over in the cylinder scenario. So only in these few areas in the president's vision for an innovation strategy did we see this use every tool in the toolkit to get to a better place. But the vast majority of R&D and commercialization activity had this non-returning, just general investment framework. Just want to set the stage for that because it's helpful to understand whether we made the decision as a government to exercise warrants or not is sort of secondary when you think of it the broader vision of how we envisioned an innovation economy. It puts it into perspective.
Terrific. Yeah, go ahead.
I think so. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yeah. Yes, you're good.
I won't make any direct comments on the sort of the technical sort of policy nature of Mariana's recommendations. I think they're good, and I was interested and surprised to hear about the unexercised Tesla warrants. But I think there are sort of two broad themes that I see here. One is there is a fiscal problem, and that is that the proportion of discretionary spending, which I think of as the tomorrow budget, the domestic non-defense discretionary budget, keeps falling. Spending on tomorrow, education, R&D, infrastructure. And the yesterday budget keeps rising, and politics gridlock prevents that from being redressed. And so you have R&D as a proportion of US GDP has gone from about 1.5%, I believe, historically, as a share of national spending to about 0.8%. So it's halved, effectively, in the last 15 to 20 years. That's the sort of specific fiscal problem, and I don't really see any immediate cure to that, given the politics in this town, in Washington. But more broadly, there is a cognitive problem, and if you go, anybody here would agree, if you go to Silicon Valley and you ask what's ailing you, one of the first answers on the list is government just needs to get out of the way. In this town, in Washington, people who profess Alexander Hamilton to be their hero say government just needs to get out of the way. There is a deep and very deep-seated resistance to the idea that government can be a partner in wealth creation, and it entails amnesia about the role of American government in American history, which Mariana has so eloquently set out, and we can reel off an extraordinary list of innovations that only exist because at least of partial government funding. So I think when we get to Mariana's specific proposals, there is a big cognitive problem. People don't believe government can do this, and therefore I don't think politics would permit it. So I'm trying to think of sort of gimmicky ways in which you could popularize the taxpayer getting a return from successful investments in the Teslas that it funds. And one of the thoughts, or other counterintuitive thoughts that came to me, was the privatization schemes in the 1980s. Popularized by Margaret Thatcher, of distributing shares to the public, was an extraordinarily effective political tool in making privatization popular. Now, this is obviously a different political direction you're pushing in, of more government involvement, not less. So it might sound counterintuitive, but I think we'd have to sort of think of ways of winning this argument, because that would, I don't think there's anything wrong with, there's a lot right with the policy idea you're putting forward intrinsically as a generic idea of getting government as a symbiotic partner with the private sector in terms of reaping the gains of innovation, rather than allowing the private sector to remain in a parasitic relationship with government R&D. But the real problem here is explaining this to people and making taxpayers realize they can gain from it. That's where I would focus.
Yeah, can I just come in for a minute on the tax question, because again, we always, I mean, it's quite common for the conversation to go back to, well, we do pay tax, and that is the way that the money comes back. Now, we all pay tax, so no one's doing any favor to pay tax, assuming, again, that we're all paying the tax we should, and we're not making use of all these legal and illegal loopholes. the real question is, was the tax system set up in order to be able to reap the kind of returns that are needed in order to fund these failures? Because that's almost what I want to focus on, because I think all of us agree, and I think many people, especially in the US, which has such an active, visible state funding from internet, nanotech, biotech, that's kind of, I think, just history. We know that the state has played that role. The question is, where will the money come from? So, you know, I think coming back to the market failure justification for public investment, that basically covers things like education, infrastructure, basic research. Let's just call it the basics, right? There's this wonderful quote from The Economist, which I use in the book, which basically says, you know, government, of course, has a role, but just for the basics. You know, research, skills, infrastructure, then get out of the way and let the revolutionaries do their thing. So that's why I started off with that point in the beginning, because if we admit, and let's put a big if, that what the government is doing is much more than just funding the research, the education, the infrastructure, but is actually taking on extreme risk along the entire innovation chain, including directly funding companies, of which most will fail. Either we say it should stop doing that maybe that's not its place, it should just be fixing the kind of public good problem, or if we want it to continue to do the kind of Tesla guaranteed loans, and given that Tesla just happened not to fail, but could have, just like Cylinder did, will the tax system that we're all paying into, let's just assume that we're all paying into it, not doing any favor, that is a legal issue, that legally if we don't want to go to jail we pay our taxes, will that revenue be enough to fund these massive failures? Because innovation is extremely uncertain, takes 15 to 20 years, and most fails. So if government is this lead risk taker, lead investor that I describe in the book, then the big question is, will the tax system be enough in order to fund the inevitable failures? Because I think if we just focus on how, of course, government has been and needs to continue to be funding the research, and we know that this is now under threat, especially with the whole kind of Tea Party change in the US politics, that is a different question. It's a very important question, but it's not the risk-reward question. That's more, how do we actually make sure we're, allowing government to continue to do what it did in the past politically.
Can I just repeat the point and maybe respond directly, that there is plenty of money to do these things, and I think this is Edward's point. There's plenty of money to continue funding these kinds of activities at historical or even higher than historical levels. We made a political decision in the United States not to do that, not a resource-constrained decision. And if it's a political decision to cut spending on these kinds of things, and we're cutting and don't forget, we're cutting spending at the same time on basic research and education, on those things that you call the basics that everybody agrees on. So we're cutting across the board on the stuff that everybody in this panel agrees are a core important function of government. Even in the Obama budget, we're cutting those things. So if we're cutting those things, if we came up with some, for political reasons, if we came up with some new funding mechanism, what would keep the politicians from continuing to cut those things and just say, well, great, you got a bunch of money because you made money in your Tesla stock, so we don't have to give you as much from the tax budget because we want to cut taxes or we want to spend the money on something else. And that's why I think Edward's point that this is really an optics question more than a real funding resource generation question. The most important aspects of some of these things is not so much how much money can it actually generate for the government, but can it make the return on investment for the public real to people in a way that increases political support for them.
Yes, exactly. So that's the point I was trying to make, and I think there's actually an interesting narrative thread coming up here, which, and I do believe, David, that you're right, that there is a general consensus in the panel, I'll speak for myself at any rate, that government has plenty of money. It needs to be replenished or reapportioned back to the areas that we saw so successful in the past. And the question is, how do we develop the political will to do that? So the idea of creating some sort of mechanism where the ordinary taxpayer, the 99%, actually has a dog in the fight and has the ability to see the risk, see the reward, but feel like they're participating in both the upside and the risk. Even though it's a small amount, I think that can help shift the overall narrative within the halls of D.C., in Washington, D.C., to taking that political risk and embracing the idea that the government does have the ability to reapportion tax revenues towards some of this basic research.
I mean, also, if I might just jump in too, you know, would there be a way, because I'm hearing what everyone's saying here, I mean, and we're kind of jumping ahead here, but, you know, is there a way to talk about this like a special fund, a lockboxy kind of pool of capital or something, that the gains from equity shares in these companies would go back into a thing that doesn't go into the general budget, can't be cut, can't be shifted to education or something else, but it's just kind of to be reinvested in other technologies? I mean, there might be ways that you could constrain the pot of money that actually could have both parties kind of buy in, because I think both parties in the kind of, or even both ends of the political spectrum, do see the value of investment in new technology things.
Well, yeah, that's done at the state level with lotteries. So lotteries are lockboxed, and lotteries are used to apportion funds to specific education or what have you. That's a mechanism that does exist at the state level.
Here, I mean, if I understood Mariana's proposal, that would be the whole idea, that any money or funds generated by equity or paying a royalty for the use of technology and making money off of it would go into some fund that would only be for funding future technology investment. That's how I understood it. And I don't understand why that's even controversial. Why not? I mean, like you said, the universities do it. I don't know if any states are doing that. It makes perfect sense. If you don't make any money in your company on the technology invented, you don't pay anything. But if you're out there like Google and Apple making incredible amounts of money, well, why shouldn't you be paying back? If it was a VC who invested in you, you'd be paying back that VC big time. You're paying a couple percent on your revenue or your post-tax revenue, whatever. I don't see why that's particularly controversial, especially if it goes back into the fund. And on David's point, yes, the Congress could turn around and say, well, you've generated, you know, $10 billion from these funds, so we're going to cut you by $10 billion from your $130 billion. It could say that, but we're seeing it's cutting it anyway. So you could make the other argument that you'll actually have a source of funds that's not dependent on whether Congress would appropriate funds for R&D. So I think that's you know, another way to look at the same problem. And the final point I'd like to make is I'd like to go back to the 1% problem. And I went to Stanford. I love Stanford. I had a great education at Stanford. But frankly, I look at Stanford raising $1 billion a year from its alumni, the incredible wealth I see out there. And then I look at Berkeley. I look at our public research universities that are being cut and cut and cut by the taxpayers and say, if I had any money to give to a university, I wouldn't give it to Stanford. I would give it to Berkeley or give it to, you know, UCSD or someplace. Because I think we're seeing that the 1% or the 1/10 of 1% are making humongous amounts of money, and they're giving it to the Stanfords and the Yales and the Harvards and, you know, a few of the others, and other places are getting starved. So we already have a really big 1% problem. I think it's certainly part of it's the tax system, and there's a lot of other reasons for it. But I think that just, you know, focusing on what Mariana said, it seems to me a no-brainer. I mean, we should be finding a way to generate revenue off of inventions. And to me, if a company fails to make money, it doesn't pay anything. But if it's making a lot of money, like Apple, humongous amounts of money, $500 billion capitalization, and then trying to get away from even paying taxes, much less you know, paying royalties on all that, I think that could be explained to people. And I would think your average taxpayer would say, why haven't we been getting any kind of royalty or any kind of equity in these companies? What's wrong with our Congress? What's wrong with the taxpayer? And my final point is I totally agree with David and others on the question that it's a political question. And I agree it's a priorities question. We're finally getting our way out of Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe $3 trillion down the rat hole that could have gone into R&D, education, infrastructure, all the things we've talked about, and to a stronger economy. So yes, priorities are critical, politics is critical, but I don't think that changes Mariana's point one way or the other. I do think we have a potential narrative there that as a taxpayer, I'd be angry. I would say, why haven't we been getting any royalties off of this? Why don't we get any equity in these companies? This is ridiculous. Rather than saying, oh, this is government intervention, this is the government, you know, doesn't know what it's doing. I think the government not knowing what it's doing is its failure to do these things. Rather than the government can't pick winners and losers, this kind of argument. That's nothing to do with that argument. Because if they lose, they don't pay anything. So anyway, that's sort of my take on it.
I just want to briefly, although this is off topic, defend the University of California at Berkeley, where I'm a trustee of the foundation. Berkeley actually raises a tremendous amount of private philanthropic money, really comparable to Stanford if you take out the medical school, which is in schools with medical, universities with medical schools always raise much more money than universities without medical schools because so many donations are related to the care that people receive. If you take that out, or if you add in UCSF, which is essentially the medical school, that would be associated with the University of California, Berkeley is raising a comparable amount of money to Stanford. So.
Maybe it has to go to Foothill College then, huh?
What's that?
Maybe it has to go to Foothill College. I mean, there are other research universities in the country that
Yeah. Berkeley is one of the few.
Berkeley does well. You're right about that.
Oh, okay, well, Mariana, just as a check-in, go ahead.
Well,
yeah, I was going to go back to you.
This is why I think it's really useful if we pretend that we're back in the 1990s, okay? Because the current political gridlock in the U.S. raises all sorts of other issues which are important, they're related, but it's not this issue. So, in the 1990s, there wasn't the threat to the current budgets that we have today. So apparently, the NSF is worried about something like 25% cuts, as is the NIH. So we didn't have that problem there, but we had the 1% problem, which, let me just phrase that differently, which is that the relationship between innovation and inequality, which in some ways is what we're talking about, is not just about the whole skills question, right? This is how currently today people talk about innovation and inequality, because when you have these big revolutions, whether it's internet or whatever, then some people get left behind who don't have the skills, and it's inevitable that you will get these, income polarizations. Now, I think what the problem is in terms of the relationship with what we're talking about is actually about value extraction. That because we don't have a narrative, we also don't have a theory. Well, that's more the economics problem. But anyway, a narrative which actually really talks about the state as doing what it has done, which has been mission-oriented, funded, again, the entire chain, huge amounts of money, so $32 billion a year is what the National Institutes of Health spend. Then we don't admit that. And because innovation is so cumulative and path-dependent, if you think of it as a curve, a cumulative distribution curve, what we have had is some agents in the economy, in the ecosystem, been able to enter much later, right? So biotech, 20 years of NIH-funded research, then VC, venture capital comes in 15 to 20 years later, and is able to capture the entire integral underneath that curve because we socialize the risks but not the rewards. Now again, if we had a functional taxation system, perhaps, again, with the higher rates, that would be less easy to do. And it's not a coincidence, what I mentioned before, that it was actually the National Venture Capital Association that lobbied for taxes to fall to the degree they have, at least the capital gains tax, which, by the way, Piketty, in this new, much talked about book, focuses on quite a bit. So if we think about this whole value extraction problem in that way, then the point is simply how do we make sure that the returns under this cumulative distribution curve, where it takes a long time for the profits to actually appear, for example, today in clean technology, they're not really there yet, they will be in about 15 years, who has the right to a share of those profits? And I recently went to Google to speak to Arun Majumdar, who was one of the first directors of ARPA-E under Steve Chu. He's now directing Google's energy program. Well, he's the vice president. And he seemed to agree with this point, which is today we no longer have, call it a Bell Labs 2.0. Who's going to fund it? How do we fund it? And the idea that we thought about together literally on a whiteboard was that we should get the private and the public sector to be funding, let's just call it an endowment, which earns a rate of interest, which funds our Bell Labs 2.0, which creates the spin-outs and the licenses and whatever, which government does retain equity in, which then goes back into funding the endowment. Another question there, which I didn't talk about with Arun, but I feel like it's the elephant in the room in our discussion, which is the fall in the private sector's commitment to this stuff, right? So we don't have the Bell Labs and the Xerox parks in our big companies today, whether it's Cisco or Pfizer. In the pharmaceutical industry, companies are cutting the R part of R&D. Cisco spends almost just as much on share buybacks than it does on R&D. So this comes to the question of, do we have a symbiotic or parasitic ecosystem, which, however, does raise other issues, but they're related because we're sort of letting the private sector, I think, get off the hook. So innovation policy should not just be about telling government to do more, but it should be related, I think, to, say, some corporate governance issues, which are getting worse and worse. So the last 10 years, the Fortune 500 companies have spent $3 trillion on buybacks. Bill Lazonick writes a lot about this. And I think that is related because one of the reasons that we need actually a really active public sector in this space is not just because it has always been active with these mission-oriented investments that led to the internet, nanotech, et cetera, but because private finance is actually retreating. And this is a question, I think, which is, again, related, but also shows even more so why government should be getting a direct share, because it's actually taking on increasingly risks which private companies are increasingly not willing to take, with many exceptions, of course.
So Mariana's keying up a bunch of interesting questions here, but I mean, one is the general way is, how does the tech community, how does the VC community, how do they start wrapping their head around, like you say, this different way of cutting the pie, this different way of approaching it? Robert, you had a thought there, but why doesn't everyone kind of chime in at some point on how could we move this along? Because I think it's the critical. If you got the right interest groups around it aligned, I think you would go a lot further than changing all of public opinion or something. Robert, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter. So, Mariana, you talked eloquently about your conversation over at Google with the former director of DARPA, and I think actually DARPA provides an optimistic view of what can happen. Before I come back to that point, though, I do want to make sure that we're counting all of the assets, all of the returns that government and the people of the United States enjoy from our investments. And you and I spoke about this when we were at the Long Now function, and that is that there's Joseph Nye, kind of popular at the Harvard Kennedy School, popularized the concept of soft power. And I think it's inarguable that the U.S. enjoys an enormous amount of soft power that's accrued to the balance sheet. As much as goodwill accrues to a company's balance sheet, the U.S. as a country, as a culture, has accrued a massive amount of goodwill with respect to soft power. That is the Mickey Mouses, the Apple, you fill in the blank. There's many, many examples of American culture that have gone to define the narrative worldwide, for better or for worse. But it still is it's a massive return on our investment. But coming back to this DARPA idea for a moment, I think that, and perhaps it's because I'm looking outside at a rising sea level about 30 feet below me, but I think that DARPA worked at a time when the U.S. was under existential threat. And it worked because the citizenry understood that we needed to invest massive amounts of money to counteract ICBMs at that point. And I think that if we focus the sharp end of the arrow toward climate change, toward the fact that everybody I think that the proof is obvious now to everybody that climate change is real and climate change threatens all of us. It's an existential threat. And I think we can use that as the sharp end of the spear to rally citizens around funding basic research to battle climate change. Banning raised that as an issue, a fundamental issue at the beginning of the hour. And I think that might be an interesting way to enter the battle.
I don't want to make this too political, but I think that there's a fundamental political difference between the factors that work in funding defense in the 1960s and 70s and the factors that work in advancing renewable energy today, and that is that there wasn't really a peace industry that benefited from the continuance, that benefited from peace and was opposed to defense spending. In fact, there's a huge military-industrial complex that benefited from an increased defense establishment. And the reason we can't advance climate change today doesn't have to do with the public. It has to do with the fact that there's a huge industry that's making a tremendous amount of money from the status quo and is very motivated to keep it the way it is. And so the ability to I don't think that the reason that DARPA was able to be funded has much to do with the fact that the public was behind, the Cold War, as it had to do with the fact that there was a large sector of the economy with a lot of political influence in Washington and elsewhere that was prepared to support that as part of a defense complex that they benefited from. That's a pessimistic point of view, because I don't see how you replicate that in the present world, because, as you say, the Silicon Valley types who are the analog today, the people who benefit from government investment in this kind of stuff, tend to be these libertarians who pretend that they did it all themselves, at least the wealthy ones, right? The average workers are not mostly like that. The average workers vote for Democrats and believe in investment in education. But there is an increasing libertarianism at the top of these industries that's like, oh yeah, we can do this all on our own, and they probably could for 5 or 10 or 15 years, right? They can coast on everything that's been done in the past. So in the short term, they've got a valid perspective. It's not like you can prove them wrong immediately. And yet, if we go down that path, the longer-term consequences are pretty significant.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in here? I totally agree with David. I think he's right on all fronts there. I think that, I'm right here in Washington at a think tank where we just had a missile defense conference sponsored by Raytheon, and we had a disruptive defense conference, technology conference sponsored by Northrop Grumman. It's not just that now we've added the intelligence complex to the military-industrial complex, and there's a huge vested interest in maintaining the threat level. You have 1,500 companies or so who are companies consulting to the intelligence industry. You can bet every one of them wants to tell you why there's such a big threat. You better keep funding them to get the terrorist or whoever they think they're getting. And then in the military-industrial part, too. Of course, they're going to continue pushing. And I agree also that we have the rallying point of the Cold War and all the dangers, and that's worn pretty thin. But nevertheless, the lobbying in Washington is astronomical in the billions of dollars and quite successful. So it is a very big political problem. But the other side of it is, how do we build a strategic narrative? And that's, a lot of Silicon Valley seems to be focused on better apps and cool things. And, I tried on the Oculus over at Singularity University, and it's pretty cool. A lot of good stuff. But that's what I've tried to bring together is the people in the government who do care about the big challenges like climate change and food, water, all these others, with people in the Valley and the S&T community to say, well, can we help try to meet those challenges? Can we harness the technology to focus on the things that are really threatening to us? And that's one side of it. Let's get Silicon Valley to not just care about, only thing about Washington is, oh, they're regulators, they're taxers, they're in our way. And maybe you need to work with government to try to solve these really big problems that threaten all of us. And then we need to build a strategic narrative about how that is what really is the threat down the road to our civilization, are these other challenges. It's the pogo problem. We met the enemy, and the enemy is us, and what we're doing to our own planet and our own civilization. So that is a different narrative. It's very hard to push. You have a Tea Party that doesn't believe in science, much less government. So it's not easy, but maybe we need to be taking the big picture rather than innovation for its own sake. That it's great to have an innovative economy because it's going to do what? Well, make more iPhones. And say we need to innovate because we have big challenges as a human civilization to meet. And I agree also on the soft power point that Robert made. I know Joe Nye, and I think he's right on that point. That is our big, what we've contributed to the world and perceived of. And we should be taking real leadership on how do you harness technology and science to meet the really big challenges forward. How are we going to have 50% to 100% more food production for 9 billion people in 2050? More energy production without frying the planet. Water, just basic things are a really big challenge. The technology is going to have to be key to it. And how do we build a narrative about that, which means that's why government has to be involved in helping build this. It's a public-private partnership. We need to marshal all these people. But right now, I go to Silicon Valley, and other than sort of some individual professors and Singularity, most of it seems to be pretty much focused on making better, cool gadgets that they're going to make a lot of money for some people, but aren't necessarily going to deal with the big problems we all face. So that, I think, would help if we could kind of change the narrative, that then we bore down and to say, well, how do we finance this and make it happen, which Mariana has contributed.
You know that one thing I find really curious is that the debate and the narrative around the national debt, right? So somehow this issue that our grandchildren are going to have to pay, and so we need to be really careful, due to high interest rates, etc. we don't have that same level of discussion talking about our grandchildren with innovation. So, shale gas, fracking, was almost 100% government funded, at least initially. Then, of course, as with every other big innovation, the private sector entered later. Where was the debate amongst the population, the tax-paying population that funded shale, on whether that was the right direction to go? Because innovation doesn't just have a rate, it has a direction. And, this is interesting because my friends who study more, if you want, the political science dimension to the state and theories of the state often are saying, yeah, but you're assuming that the state is somehow this, entity, homogenous entity. But if you think of sort of civil society behind it, and, this is, I think, quite curious how anyway, there's been a complete lack of debate on shale beyond the issue about what happens underground, the earthquake dimension, and whether that was the right direction for government to be spending huge amounts of tax dollars on. But again, even the whole Obamacare, the health care debate was also fascinating, because I kind of always wondered who was advising Obama in the discussion about that was bad because the government is therefore meddling in our healthcare choices. You would have thought that, given again all this NIH money that apparently is responsible for something like 75% of the new molecular entities with priority rating, so the really high risk, again, drugs, that someone would have helped him engage in that discussion by saying, meddling in your healthcare? We created your healthcare, or at least we co-created it. And so this is, again, how useful it would be to really change the language that we use to talk about government's role in these innovation ecosystems, not just as facilitating, not just as correcting market failures, but being a lead creator, lead engine, lead risk taker, and that would follow through in affecting also these debates about really important things like healthcare, the fact that 60 million people were uninsured and the government was trying to do something about it but didn't have the language to actually talk about it.
Aneesh, why don't we jump to you, since you were inside, I mean, kind of build on this and give that context a little bit of the inside view there. And then go to Ed. You're muted out. You got to just unmute.
There we go. Yeah, no, I'm very keen to engage. There's a lot we've talked about in the last half hour, but let me begin by just kind of putting some context again around where we are. The President asked his Council of Advisors of Science and Technology, which includes people like Eric Schmidt from Google and other research scientists, and asked this question: where are there bottlenecks in the innovation ecosystem that we might help unclog or to help pump up, depending on your perspective? Is it a barrier or is it an opportunity? And what they found was that with a modest amount of funding, in between general basic research and actually cutting a deal for a particular company, is this realm of pre-competitive R&D that's a bit more applied. It's actually, in my book, I hearken this back to Herbert Hoover when he was Secretary of Commerce, not President, had a term, associative state, which was the idea that if you can pool folks together, there's some common barriers that perhaps the state might help unlock through some shared investment. This has appeared as what we're calling a national network of manufacturing institutes or innovation institutes, about $1 billion concept that the President has outlined, actually in 2 states of the Union back to back. And the basic logic is, for example, 3D printing might be a new platform that will spark dozens of companies, not picking one 3D printing company to invest in, but rather enabling technologies between universities, the private sector, and the federal government. So these first batch of institutes have been stood up. They have the right to conduct technology transfer that would allow them to have some type of sharing in the upside. My presumption will be more through license revenue, but that'll be up for those university consortia to sort out. And the premise being $1 billion matched by the private sector and university support actually could unclog half a dozen sort of enabling technologies that could foster dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of startups that could be a big part of our growth going forward. So I'm a big fan of modeling and simulation technologies and their impact on manufacturing. You can look at the Materials Genome Initiative, which is modeling and simulation essentially to cut in half the time to bring new materials to market. So we have a framework to make these investments north of basic R&D, south of direct injecting into a company, and a sharing of risk model with the public sector, private sector, and university community with commercialization payback. I think rather than inventing a new wheel, kind of doubling down on that model and finding ways to maybe juice up the return potential, given some of Mariana's comments or others. There are a few of these up and running now on the manufacturing institutes. Let's tweak the model. I think there's bipartisan support for much of that work, and it could be the basis of some of the vision that we're hearing in this conversation today.
I have a question for Mariana, who is thankfully back. I thought you were going to disappear. I'm very. I can't hear you though. I'm very glad that you mentioned Bell Labs and Xerox PARC, because I think 2/3 or at least half of the answers to the quality of future R&D coming out of this country, coming out of the United States, is tied up with whether the private sector is going to start increasing its R&D, and particularly the R of the R&D again, and whether we're going to get the kinds of scientific research you saw in the days of Bell Labs, which wasn't about the next gadget or the next commercial spin-off. A lot of this was eureka science. And what it was that changed about shareholder horizons, the time horizons for the private sector, that led to the decline of that kind of research and development. I mean, it's clear. I was at a meeting a few months ago, maybe a year ago, with Alan Greenspan, who surprisingly, I guess, given where he comes from on the spectrum, mentioned that the Dreamliner, Boeing's Dreamliner, the most sophisticated commercial plane ever produced, with extraordinary breakthroughs at so many different levels, took a 20-25 year time horizon of investment. There's only 2 or 3 companies left in the United States that aren't, or indeed around the world, that aren't at least partially state-controlled, that have that kind of time horizon. Most companies don't have it. We have $2 trillion or thereabouts of cash on corporate treasury accounts in the United States, uninvested. Now, every CEO you talk to, every CTO you talk to, every investor you talk to sees myriad investment opportunities over 3, 5, 10-year horizons, but nobody can actually get to the point where they're putting the money up now. So I think, the question of how do you recreate a Bell Labs in the private sector and have more of those is something I'd be fascinated to hear the answer to. I don't know what it would be.
I think the answer is absolutely clear, and I think the answer is that can't happen today. I think those investments by Bell Labs and by Xerox PARC were unsuccessful investments that actually cost them money. They only did those things because they had monopolies, because they didn't actually have strong incentives to return money to shareholders. The Dreamliner is also something that Boeing probably regrets it would not do in the same way today. Their next plane, the 777X project, is actually less ambitious than the Dreamliner because they're saying let's do only a smaller level of innovation that we know we can manage. I think corporate America has evolved in such a way that the push for the highest return to shareholders in the shortest period of time, and to some extent the incentive return also to executives who reap a large benefit of the rewards based on share performance. I just think, unfortunately, we're not going to see that kind of investment from the private sector again. That it was a unique time in history, and times have changed. And I would love to bring it back because it was great for society. But I don't think it was good for those companies, and so I think the CEOs who are making the rational decision not to do that kind of thing today are actually responding correctly to the incentives that they've got. That's my unfortunate but true.
Well, in the spirit of reinventors, I mean, the idea is how do we change some of the parameters, or how do you move this forward? And maybe you do create a fund that.
Well, China is doing it. China is doing it because they have state investment. So the answer is that the returns for those projects are real, but they're very diffuse. They're exactly along the lines of the kind of basic, externalities that Mariana started out talking about, where the benefits are large and accrue across society, but aren't very well captured by the individual investors, and so that is a kind of market failure. But the United States is not going to adopt state capitalism like China. I don't think that that's one of the realistic possibilities here. Incremental moves in that direction could have some potential, but I'm not terribly optimistic in this political environment. I'm not sure exactly what the right answer is, but I do think that if you're hoping that somehow Bell Labs is going to come back, that it's just not very likely at all.
Well, I don't think that the point is to sort of be folkloristic about it and pretend that, we need to go back in time to some, beautiful age. It's more understanding what has changed and what sort of fundamental ingredients you need in order to have this kind of symbiotic, again, ecosystem. So one issue that I think you're raising kind of directly and indirectly is how financialized we have become. The advanced modern capitalism has become much more than it was in the 60s and 50s and early 70s. And so, first of all, if you look at any particular sector, industry, like telecommunications, you have some companies like Huawei and Ericsson actually doing no share buybacks, and others like Cisco going crazy with share buybacks. So there's choices to be made at the company level. And one issue I think that is really important is getting government confident enough where it's not just funding the stuff, whether it's R&D, applied research, or the early stage of companies. It's also getting a proper deal, like literally a deal, not just the New Deal, but a deal with business where both are not just participating, but also government can actually ask business to change. So, Bell Labs, and I'm not an expert, so correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you probably know more of the history. Bell Labs, from what I understand, was also an outcome of an agreement, a deal with government. It was a big monopoly, and there was pressure on AT&T to reinvest its profits back into the economy, as opposed to what Ed's talking about, which is record level hoarding rates, $2 trillion in the U.S., $1 trillion in Europe, and also record level spending of profits into very financialized areas. And when you ask the top buybackers why they're doing it, why aren't you investing in the R of R&D, so the future wave? Why aren't you investing in human capital? The answer is that there's no investment opportunities. And then you look at the biggest, buybackers, which is oil and pharma, and there's no opportunities in renewables. There's no opportunities in life sciences. Of course there are. It's just that they're making a choice not to invest in them and often waiting for government to pick up the bill. And as you say, China, by the way, is picking up the massive bill in terms of renewables. If you look at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance data, so there's just 4 state investment banks in the world, the Chinese one, the German one, Brazilian, and the European Investment Bank, which are basically spending something like 8 times as much as the entire private sector worldwide, which is private equity, VC, stock market, and corporate. And just one last point, the VC model is really broken. So venture capital is all exit focused. They want an exit in 3 years, mainly through an IPO, and innovation takes 15 to 20 years. So the degree to which that particular financing model can actually produce the next big thing after nanotech or whatever is really a problem. And if it is true that they always come in after the stuff is really funded, the degree to which, again, they should be seen as the big risk takers and position themselves as the entrepreneurial force of places like Silicon Valley, I think that's the problem. That government has been captured by that narrative and hasn't been able to negotiate properly. It hasn't admitted that it actually is one of the key entrepreneurial forces, not the kind of parasitic VC model that we have today.
So I want to just come in with this thread toward dystopia that I think David is championing, and observe that the reason for share buybacks is pretty clear. It's 2 letters. It's PE. So if you look at the way that executives are compensated, and you look at price equity ratio, share buybacks make sense for somebody, and it's probably management. But broadening the discussion back to something that might be a bit more optimistic, I do want to just give a shout out for James Gleick's book, The Information. And actually, I think that might be, Ed, one of your compatriots. And he has a wonderful history on Claude Shannon and the birth of the information theory coming from Bell Labs. Again, going back to this idea that Bell Labs is really, that the impetus for Bell Labs was around World War II and developing fundamental technology when we were faced with an existential threat. I very much liked Ed's idea that Maggie Thatcher and the age of privatization back in the 80s in the UK and also I think Ronald Reagan as well. I think that judo might provide an interesting metaphor for us. We're a small, merry band of dystopians here, looking at how do we transform this massive shibboleth that is government. And I think that judo uses the motion or movement of your opponent and then redirects it. And I think this idea that the Tea Party have, that government is evil, this idea that people have, that they really, have a high degree of skepticism around government, can actually be rechanneled into this idea of giving people an opportunity through, I won't call it redistribution of shares, but giving people this opportunity. I'm going back now to this idea of taking the 1%, 99% narrative and reshaping that by giving people this notion that we're faced with an existential threat, whether it be climate change, whether it be food, whether it be water. I mean, you can pick a couple of different areas that would be collectively non-controversial. You could pick your area, and then give people an upside opportunity in participating in that. And clearly there's mechanisms that have to be developed, et cetera. But I do think that history proves again and again and again that human beings as a social group come together collectively and make change when they're faced with an existential threat. We have the threat, we have the knowledge of how to deal with this, in that innovation is the only hope we have to survive this existential threat. And so we need a mechanism to make that happen.
I'll jump in for one quick thing. Taking a quick look at Paul Kennedy's book, Engineers of Victory, about World War II. Pretty amazing in about an 18-month period when, after a strategic challenge was laid out and a set of objectives by Roosevelt and Churchill, we mobilized using government, private sector to solve all these great technical challenges, like getting at U-boats that were destroying the convoys to Europe in the middle of the Atlantic where there was no air cover, et cetera. They laid out the challenges, and in 18 months they just turned the whole war around. We were losing in 42, 43. And it turned around because of this kind of public-private partnership, effective management, effective use of science and technology, mobilizing it, engineers. And, we need the narrative that says, hey, we can do this. We've got this big challenge. We can pull these people together, and we can do this. We can meet the challenge, like Robert was saying. But we haven't built that narrative out. And I think that the pieces are there, but we're really not being very good at putting it out there. Maybe David has some ideas.
Well, actually, we're kind of getting to the point here in the session where we do have to look. We try to look to a relatively hard out at the after 9 minutes. There's been a lot of interesting pieces out here. There's been a lot of building on Mariana and also some challenges to it and thinking about it. I think what we need to do is kind of go around the table here and just kind of each of you to think about, what do you think we learned here? What might have been accomplished? And then also something about what would really need to be done next to really make this idea or something comparable to it take it to the next stage. I mean, there's been political threads here. There's been economic thinking threads. There's been, what can just people do around this? And, what would be something that someone could do if you needed to go to the next step of trying to move this issue down the wall? And then we're going to end with Mariana. Why don't you collect your thoughts on just, summing up a little bit of what you thought was accomplished here before we end up. Aneesh, do you want to kind of maybe start on the roundtable, and we'll just go around and just take a minute or two just to kind of give your sense of where we're at with this big issue.
Well, there's a lot to kind of weigh in on. I would say that there is something sort of on the surface appealing of a call to action to the American people with a chance to benefit in its participation. We've seen call to actions work in other contexts without the same equity upside. I'll say, for example, Congress has bequeathed in a bipartisan basis what we call prize authority. So if you remember in the 1700s, the UK couldn't solve the problem of longitude, and they offered up what is now a $3.5 million prize to anyone, and a watchmaker named Harrison stepped up, wasn't high on the list of people likely to solve this problem, and there he was, having solved it. So now we have prizes and challenges available to every federal agency that have this sort of all hands on deck, we all have a stake in this, and it's a lot lower barriers to entry and a lot better for public participation. You can visit them at challenge.gov. My personal favorite, you talked about climate change a lot over the course of this conversation. Right now, there's $1 billion hidden tax against the solar industry in the U.S., and that has bipartisan support to reduce, and that is reducing the red tape on permitting and soft costs associated with installing solar. So the Department of Energy now has a $10 million prize to the team of entrepreneurial installers and public sector officials who want to help enable them, and same-day permitting rules and whatnot, to say if you're a team that can actually get low-cost, the magic number being $1 a watt installed, if we can get to that magic number, we will have dramatically accelerated the pace at which solar can become a bigger share of our energy mix. And so bottom line is, we have this vision of an all-hands-on-deck. We have new prize authority to fund and allow others to benefit. But going this next step of sort of an equity stake in the spinoff, that's an interesting idea. Maybe there's a way to marry these manufacturing institutes, these innovation, pre-competitive R&D, which are really a Bell Labs 2.0 you guys were talking about. They're sort of engineered in that manufacturing design. Maybe there's a way to allow for public participation in the commercialization of activity from those projects. That's a good one. Combine that with crowdfunding. Maybe there's an opportunity there. I hadn't quite put all those pieces together, but it's certainly intriguing.
Banning, why don't you go? That's terrific.
Yeah, I would. I think what Aneesh said is great, and actually the prizes are very effective. If you think about, well, the Google car came out, I think, really out of the DARPA challenge. And what is a cheaper way to do something? Gee, all you 25 different groups will work for free, and one of you will get $1 million, and you'll solve this problem for me. If I had to pay all of 25 of your groups to do the R&D, what would it be? Hundreds of millions of dollars. Pretty smart way to get people to focus on it, as well as to make it public, to rally people around it. So I think these X prizes are probably a very effective tool that ought to be tried a whole lot more. On the 1%, Robert's idea, I tend to think that you don't necessarily have to give the average person a piece of the action of a company. I think if you got people to see as a country, their government is failing to take a piece, and by gosh, it ought to be. And shouldn't my government? I'm paying all this money for developing Siri. Shouldn't I get a piece of the profits out of the iPhone for that Siri, or whatever it might be? I think that would get people a sense of the 99% are actually getting something from it, even though it may not come to them personally. It's going to either reduce their tax burden or put money into, however you want to cut up that money. Maybe it goes just back into R&D. But I think that would give them a sense of stake in what the government is spending, that the government and the people indirectly would ultimately benefit by generating, these new technologies that generate income. So I think that could be a pretty effective way to do it. But overall, I think that we have to work on the bigger strategic narrative of why this is important, why we are, in fact, in an existential situation here. It's just a slow-moving one, right? It's like a nuclear war that takes place over 50 years rather than 50 seconds or 50 minutes. And I think we need to marshal technology. And what we haven't talked about here is sort of the international collaboration of it. Science and technology today is an international activity. It's not a national activity. You look at any scientific journal and look at the authors of any article, it's like 30 of them from all over the world. It's the social scientists who love to keep the one or two people, the egomaniacs. But in any case, the Joy's law was sort of indirectly mentioned here. The smartest people don't work for you. The smartest people are all over the planet. How do you pull them together to meet the big grand challenges? And that runs up against the question of national competitiveness. Are you helping the Chinese get better at dealing with in biotech by what you're doing by cooperating with them or training their people and to our disadvantage as a nation? Or are you advancing technology to solve big problems on a global scale? That's another issue that maybe reinventors ought to address at some later.
We may do that, but right now we're going to have to move to David. Do you want to do a quick final thoughts, and then we'll go on?
Do 4 very quick final thoughts. First, I disagree with the idea that venture capital is broken. I think venture capital is actually functioning very well. It, however, only serves a limited slice of what needs to be done. So I think venture capital is advancing a kind of entrepreneurship that turns ideas and supports entrepreneurs in building companies that is essential and is not going to be replaced by this, whatever it is we're talking about, even if it existed. Secondly, prizes are great, but DARPA actually spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on direct research funding for autonomous vehicles in the first place, which is how we got to the point where we could even think about having a grand challenge for vehicles. So, I think a lot of these things that we're talking about are additive to existing models and can't be viewed as replacing them. That's important. The third is that the internationalization and globalization are tremendously important. And the main way they're important here is thinking about this cycle of funding that we sort of alluded to earlier, that the government would fund activities that would grow the economy, that would then generate more tax revenue, which could then be reinvested in more of that. One way that fails to work as well in the modern world is that the loop is broken because a lot of the economic activity that's generated by new ideas and research is in other countries and therefore can't be taxed directly by the United States. So we have to either adopt the point of view that we're being philanthropic to some extent and lifting up the whole world, which is a hard sell to taxpayers in a time when they're convinced that they're overtaxed and resource constrained, or we have to come up with a new model for somehow closing that loop. And the fourth point is an idea that I just sort of been thinking about, an analogy with, say, the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a method for providing direct returns to Alaska residents from the Alaska oil industry. Now, whatever you think of the oil industry, the idea, it certainly has been that model has been very successful in building political support in Alaska for the oil industry. And therefore, if you could imagine a national entrepreneurship fund that somehow generated a return to citizens from these kinds of entrepreneurial activities, I could imagine that could have a significant psychological impact on building support for this kind of thing. Whether that's feasible, I don't know, and there's always a lot of details, but it is a kind of a concept to bat around.
Yeah, here. I think the Alaska Permanent Fund's a great idea as a mechanism and a good analog. I'm skeptical of 3 things here. I'm skeptical, one, of government's ability to pick winners. And I think that there are mechanisms out there to address that. One could be kind of a hedge fund approach, where basically the government looks or takes a position in any investment that a venture fund or some other smart investment manager is making as part of that golden share that you talked about, Mariana. There are other mechanisms out there. Second, I'm very much skeptical on citizens' willingness to reshape the priorities of government funding. I think toward direct R&D. I think that there are many narratives out there that battle against that, and generally people are skeptical of government. So what government tells them they should do, they'll do the opposite. And thirdly, I'm skeptical that any average citizen is going to take or want to take an active interest in making investments. I love crowdsourcing. I've got a couple of companies that I'm working with that are funding through crowdsourcing. It's highly effective for those people who want to make investments on a small scale, but that's not going to distribute economic opportunity across the vast majority of citizens who don't want to take an active role in managing investments. But I do think, coming back to this idea of judo, that using something like the Alaska Permanent Fund, using something that shows citizens that they can actually have a piece of equity as part of their overall portfolio, does a number of very positive things for us. It gets people interested in companies' success. It makes them aware that companies sometimes fail, and it makes them feel like they're part of the investment return that their government is making in a very direct way. And again, I think the best way to do that is to focus on the existential threats that we face that Banning talked about early on. Those are existential threats. Those are the World War IIs of our time that people will come together to fight and spend their money on.
I don't want to repeat a lot of the good summaries and ideas others have come up with, mostly because they're not my ideas, but also because I agree with the general tenor of what's been said. I love the idea of an Alaska-style national entrepreneurship fund. I think that's a really interesting one. I guess a bit like the drunk man looking for his keys under the lamppost. I am in Washington D.C. and I cannot escape. I cannot escape the politics of all of this. I do think that most of what Mariana is putting forward, and others are for the most part agreeing with, is stuff that shouldn't be that controversial. Perhaps some of it is. Some of the mechanisms for doing this, are open to debate. But having a better way of the state getting a return, and the taxpayer getting a return from R&D so that it can better fund it, it seems to me to be a no-brainer. So I can't, drunk man and keys style, get away from the politics of this. How do we sell it? And the Tesla example seems to me to be classic. Very, very few people know about it. We know about the Solyndra case. Most Americans are aware of Solyndra. It was on the headline, the front page for many months on and off. Tesla is on the front page for different reasons, but the government's role is much less well known. And I think, perhaps it's fortunate that Aneesh has disappeared, but I do think that, with apologies to Aneesh, the Obama administration bears some responsibility here. It's had golden opportunity after golden opportunity to instruct and evangelize the American public on what government can do as a partner. And on most, if not every occasion, it's flunked or ducked that opportunity. So I do think, we can't get away from the politics here. It is possible to change the conversation. We've had a potential paradigm changing moment in the last 5-6 years with the 2008 meltdown, with calling into question of many of the precepts that have led up to the 2008 meltdown, and we've ducked the opportunity to question the paradigm, and I think that is a disappointment. But it is possible to do. The conversation can be changed. So the one sort of gimmicky takeaway I'll take from this is David's idea of the Alaska Fund. I think that's genius.
Mariana, thanks, Ed. Sum it up and for us, and then we'll be out.
Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, I found the conversation incredibly interesting, and I'm hoping it's just the beginning of a longer conversations that we continue this in some way. By the way, we've organized in London a conference on July 22nd to 24th precisely on this issue. It's called Mission-Oriented Finance. And one of the big missions is, in fact, of course, for government, full employment. That's the Keynesian mission. And how to get that together with the Schumpeterian mission of innovation, I think, is really interesting. Because if we think of it from the taxpayers or the population's point of view, because this is all taxpayer money, right? This is Google's algorithm, taxpayer funded. All the technologies behind the iPhone, taxpayer funded. The question is, to put it provocatively, are we happy that currently, how the current system is working, that it's functioning in terms of things like the public education system? So in Silicon Valley, as we know, public education is no longer what it was in the 70s. Or are we happy with the prices of drugs still being as high as though the pharmaceutical companies were still spending as much as they like to justify these high prices with in terms of their spending on R&D? So in some ways, the problem is the opposite of what we're talking about, which is the share on the one side is getting higher and higher on the private sector side, and so the share inevitably of the public sector side is getting smaller and smaller. So in one way, it's not necessarily that the public sector should take a direct equity, but it should at least be getting its correct share. And coming back to tax, it's not just the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the top marginal rate tax changes. It's also this huge amount of different tax incentives that are introduced every year in order to stimulate innovation without any evidence that things like R&D tax credits actually make R&D happen that wouldn't have happened anyway. But if you start summing up all the taxable income that is not then taxed through these tax incentives in the name of innovation, that would itself increase the share of government quite a bit, and that would require government, as I was saying in the beginning, to be quite confident of its role in the innovation ecosystem. So we know that most big R&D spending is actually driven by the perception of investors of where the future technological and market opportunities are. And what we've just been talking about for the last hour is this very high correlation between those market and technological opportunities and very active, directed, risk-taking government spending. So the logical consequence would be to make sure that we allow that part of the funding to not only increase, but also make sure that the private companies don't have so much power as they currently have to constantly negotiate for these tax reductions, which again are increasingly around these tax incentives. Like in the UK, just this year, the patent box scheme is going to hurt the UK government's tax revenue by $3 billion, just for a small country, and hurt its innovation ecosystem. So I think the conversation is much broader. It's about the deal that government and business must have when they talk about innovation, allowing government to be confident that it's a lead risk taker and hence needs to be able to accumulate the tax revenue it needs in order to fund it. And I think we kept going back and forth in terms of the political stalemate that currently we have in the US. I personally think that these issues that we've been raising are just as relevant in the sort of 80s and 90s as they are today. Before the political stalemate. So the question is an important one to ask, and having this kind of discussion where we think about the different schemes. By the way, in terms of the Alaskan scheme, Norway has that. Norway has a very active sovereign wealth fund making a huge amount of return from the state-funded oil reserves and industry. The problem is that wealth fund today is investing then its profits into real estate. So it's a question also both on the private side and the public side to make sure that the returns to these investments are funding the next big wave, as opposed to speculative ends. It also is going to be funding the next, if you want, the whole pension system in Norway. Which is very important, but how to make sure that we are engaging in a debate that makes sure that at the organizational level, that's state organizations and business organizations, we are building these symbiotic innovation ecosystems where the profits are reinvested. I think that's the big challenge in an increasingly financialized capitalism.
All right, well, thank you very much. We've gone a little bit long here, but it's been such a rich conversation. There's been so many great ideas here, and we are sure to kind of revisit this theme with time. Thank everyone who gathered to change this up in the next couple of days. Videos edited, particularly thank you for really coming up with the idea, writing the book, and driving the conversation. Thanks all, and we'll hope to see you again on another Reinventors Roundtable.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Mariana.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.